It is the end of, I don't even know what month it is anymore. April. Oh my gosh, the end of April. Bright sunny day here in New Hampshire. Got the window open, the air flowing. Jesse's dealing with snow again, probably, and
we got
Tim's over there flooded in New York or whatever. So
we
happy
got plenty of
Friday.
rain, and I'm not complaining.
Awesome,
Hey
awesome.
Tim,
Well,
what's that in
Rangers.
your background? What's that new thing I see
Oh,
back there?
I'm
oh.
like,
Well, when Mr. Schnurr starts to get into something spicy, I can just be like, "Hold on a minute,
oh, look at that.
wait a minute, wait a minute, spicy topic." Wait, no, it gets even worse. Yeah, I hold on, let me just
Oh
adjust the
man.
brightness.
What's up
Yeah,
with the
so
weird blinking pattern? It's all over the place there. It's like Morse code. Help.
I know it's got all the little bells and
And a
whistles
new
and wait
hat. I'm liking the new hat.
in a new hat. Yes, we have the
Mm-hmm.
granddaughter today, and so in honor of our granddaughter, real men wear pink. So let's do the introductions like we normally do. Hold on, let me pull this up appropriately. Go ahead, Mr. Tim.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim Schnurr, Inquisitive IT. Based out of New York City, we're helping individuals and their financial advisors, state attorneys, accountants secure themselves. So this is pretty, not a typical practice, but that's what the focus is here in New York City. So if you got ma, grandma worried about things, we might be able to help.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks so much for that, Tim. And as always, let me drag you over here. Let me click this button. Let me do this button and go.
Hey everyone, Jesse Miller with PSA Consulting. We have the Power Grid, as you can see from my link here, and it is a community where we teach MSPs how to build scalable and profitable vCISO services. And Tim, I am excited for our conversation today, so you and I can fight
Yeah, fight,
over the
fight,
best
fight,
way to write a policy.
fight. All right, maybe I just need to do my little thing too. So let's do this. Let's do this. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Tim Golden, founder of Compliance Scorecard, where we help MSPs uncomplicate and simplify the compliance efforts in your MSP, helping you keep your risk in check. I'm getting a little better at this now. So, yes,
You want
policy.
to drive a little bit, Tim, here, or like talk about policy?
Yeah, maybe we should do this with the layout since Jesse and I are going to duke it out, right?
Okay.
Yeah, the internet is a little wonky, right?
Exactly.
Hey, Zach, thanks for joining. Policy making tip number one: make a policy to start. Oh, it's kind of funny because we do actually start with a
Love it.
policy on policy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Jesse, talk about that. Do you have a policy on policy? Because why do we have a policy?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I don't want to jump the gun too much here, but what's the number? People always ask, well, what's the number one tip for writing a good policy? I'm like, make it as short as possible. It's the old Mark Twain quote. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. Shakespeare says brevity is the soul of wit. The more concise and condensed you can be to get a point across in the fewest amount of words is really what you want to strive for here. But back to your point, Tim, is the policy of writing a policy. I typically like to use more of a playbook approach. I don't know if you'd call it a policy, having a workflow that says this is the way we build a policy. This is how we get consensus and we bring the right people into the policy. And then here are some checklist items of maybe some sections we need and of course, a template then for what it looks like. But that's kind of the way I approach it for the policy, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's kind of, hey, at least we're aligned on something, right? So, define what it is that, bring in the right key stakeholders, define, what the purpose is, the scope is, right? And have that conversation around why do we do this, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump you a little bit, Tim, and this is one of your favorite words, but I think the governance usually starts kind of like, I think cart before the horse. I think it's going to drive policy, right? And this idea of governance, or like, why is there governance, and maybe we can even talk about like the risk conversation first, right? Like, I think that like identification of risks and then kind of like who's in charge, who's accountable, who's responsible, then usually get into policy. I don't know, but maybe you guys can think of instances like where policy kind of initiates things, but I think it's usually the governance aspect of we're trying to control something because there's something good, some carrot, some stick, right? Something, either a risk or an opportunity, right? And we need the people to act in a certain way to accomplish that goal of either eliminating risk or like taking advantage of an opportunity. It's usually risk, like when let's face it, the three of us are talking cybersecurity. But like why does that drive some kind of behavior, and then who's accountable and who's who's it directed towards? So
yeah.
Go ahead, Justin.
Well, I was just going to say, I think absolutely right that we need to have accountability, and that's maybe something that I would say is one of the biggest failures that I see in a lot of security policies, and that's using should versus shall, and not actually naming who is the person or the group or the role that's supposed to execute these things. Now, in a separate piece, that's the execution of the policy, or the what, or the who, excuse me. But then what you're asking is who owns a policy, right? When do we do a policy? So I think maybe that's where we should talk about, Tim, and I'd love to hear your perspective on what are some thresholds. And I have my own thoughts on this, but I'd like to hear yours because you are the policy guru here. What are some thresholds on when it should become, when we need a policy for something?
I could talk this stuff all day long, right?
Like I said, I think it's that, like, there's either a risk or there's an opportunity, and like that's driving that intended behavior. Right? So would we call Tim? I guess would we call a policy intended behavior, or like what would you call, like if you had to back up and talk about policy without mentioning the word policy? Like what would you consider to be?
Yeah. I do like the word intended behavior, right? Because let's not even talk about cybersecurity for a minute, right? Let's talk about, I don't know, HR, employee handbook, sexual harassment, equal opportunity, blah, 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 and the list goes on and on and on, right? It's probably some of the same things you're doing in your business already, just applying the cyber spin to it, right? So whether we're talking HR or cybersecurity, the intended behavior with expected outcomes, right? To help eventually mitigate the risk, right? Why do we have an employee handbook? Because we want to let people know these are the rules in which we play by. And so we can get into all the enforcement and all who's responsible and all of that stuff. But why do we have an employee handbook? So the employees know the guide rails in which to follow, right? Why do we have a password policy? So the employees know the guide rails for password length, complexity, reuse, blah, 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 right? So it all kind of really does come back to that business risk of why do we do this work? So that everyone's on the same page, so that everybody has the guardrails and guidelines in which to follow, and eventually, help mitigate the risk to the employee, to the business, and to all parties involved.
Yeah. So, and I think those policies, like you said, guardrails, but like they all kind of have some story, right? Like there was some risk. It didn't have to happen at this company or this organization, but it happened somewhere else. As you said, sexual harassment, like money laundering, I don't know, bribing officials, right? Like all the things we usually get trained on, right? Like, insider trading, right? Like
you can even take it a step further and talk about OSHA, right? Why do we have these MSDS manuals, right? Because somebody burned themselves with some chemical, right? Why do we have this document, right? I mean, policy in and of itself, like I said, is the guardrails, is the quote unquote source of truth for an understanding and a common vernacular and a common place to go on the why we do a thing. Not to be confused with procedures about the how we do a thing, right? Policies should relate to the why story. It should relate to, and yes, I am using the word should as opposed to shall, should talk about the why, right? And talk about how that supports the mission of the business, right? How that executive summary and bringing in those executives can support the mission of the business, right?
Right. Right.
I think we short circuited the whole show just by we're kind of getting at like why policies don't work, right? Like because we just didn't do any of the things that Tim just said, right? Like we didn't talk about like the why. We didn't talk about like what could happen or what risk is it tied to or what business outcome is it tied to, right? So I think that's we're almost short circuiting the fact that like this is where things go wrong, where you just if it's a check the box activity, that's the outcome you're going to expect out of it. So
you want to hear my unpopular opinion or maybe my spicy take? You ready with your fire,
Tim? Spicier the better.
I think policies are largely a waste of time. And hear me out. The way that they're currently fashioned, I think what I have seen is the way that policies are done today, they're not usable by the end user. They're not understandable by everyone in the company. And they're typically, and this is why I asked the question, this is a bit of a rhetorical question. The main threshold I typically see for a policy is to meet a regulatory or legal requirement, right? That's why you see a security policy.
Yep.
Now, you talked about intended outcomes, Tim, and I think that's where we should be going with this. And that's why I like the idea of a playbook or a workflow for intended outcomes, because policies major in the minors and many times, and I think we're going to see that, Tim, when we look at this policy to edit, right? So what is a good policy? What are some thresholds, right? A threshold is regulatory. We may need a very detailed policy to make sure we're meeting every letter of the law for that regulatory burden. And we're not going to get around that. We have to protect ourselves as an organization. So you talked about risk, right? We are mitigating that risk by making sure that the letter of our policy stands to that. Now, how do we get the intended outcomes that we want? It's not always with the policy. It's with workflows that take that letter of the policy and pragmatically structure a guideline or a checklist to get that intended outcome that we want. So I think, maybe I was a bit hyperbolic, but I think policies are necessary, absolutely. But I think that workflows and having parallel processes that help us meet those requirements has to be a piece of what we're doing when we're thinking about policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And
totally so there's like mission statement, right, Tim? Like
I was going to say, we're going to get into the structure of a well-defined document. We're going to get into what I like to talk about, management intent, right? Jesse, you talk about outcomes, you talk about playbooks. Like, what is the intent behind doing this? And my camera is driving me crazy at the moment. So
you're coming in and out, like you're like.
I know. It's like because the camera can't focus on me; it's trying to focus on everything else. I love this AI camera, but I don't love this AI camera. So
you just gotta stay perfectly still and talk like this.
think Jurassic Park. There's a T-Rex right outside the window.
There's a checkers over my shoulder. Anyways, so So I guess we can kind of agree on policies and procedures can be a guiding thing in an organization, period. The intent behind them and the expected outcome behind them, I think we could agree on that, right? I think the way that policy we can agree on, the way that, policy and procedure documents have been kind of, put out into the space in the last decade or better, have been hard to understand, hard to operationalize, hard to enforce, like all the things, right, Jesse? I think we can agree on that so far, would you not?
Yeah, absolutely.
I do like the concept of moving them towards a living, breathing operational playbook, a living, breathing operational guide. Insert word here. It is not something that you write it once because you have a regulation, you throw it on the shelf, and you forget about it. And nobody's accountable, right, Tim? Nothing's actionable, right, Tim? Like, it just kind of sits there. I talked to a company, and I say this all the time, I don't know, a couple months ago. And I was like, when's the last time you updated your employee handbook? And they were like, I don't know, when we made it 14 years ago. Well, hold on. That's really great. Did you like? Did everybody work from home from COVID? Well, yeah. Did your employee handbook reflect that? Oh, are they still working from home? Oh, what about paternity, maternity, and they like getting those wheels spinning because no one was accountable, right? It wasn't somebody's responsibility to make sure that these things were being dealt with on some sort of cadence.
Yeah. So one add on Jesse's comment, as you said, it's like almost like this mission statement of some intended behavior, but it's great to have someone in charge. It's even better to have some kind of tool that like enforces it, right? Or like, because people enforce things, but you don't have a lot of bandwidth during the day to be like, is Chad doing the right thing? I'm not picking on Chad, but like, right? Right. So it's like, what kind of tools can you get feedback or like, right. We're going to get into metrics. We're going to, some kind of signal, right? Of like, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? So as you said, policies can just sit in the desk. Tim's policy didn't say anything about social media 14 years ago. Didn't say anything about smartphones. Didn't say anything about, I don't know what else.
Right.
So, and Jesse, like, I would say 90% of the companies are in the same place, right? Like, policies just sit there, and they're checked back with activities. Like, how many doctors' offices have policies for HIPAA? Like, how's HIPAA compliance going nowadays?
Well, you do make an interesting point there, because when was the last time you went to the doctor or dentist or any healthcare professional? I went a couple weeks ago. Finally got that darn tooth fixed, and the first thing that happened when I walked in the door was sign the consent form. Why am I signing this consent form? Because they have a policy and a procedure that says everybody that walks in the door needs to sign this thing. You're going to pay your bill. You don't want to release records. So that is actual policies and procedures in action, right? That's the outcome, right? Make sure people are going to pay their bills. Make sure they're not going to share information, or where they can appropriately share the information. So while as much as we love to say as MSPs, doctors and dentists, and they don't want to do the work, they probably already have pieces of these things already in place, right? You just might not realize it because you're not helping them to understand where they are in their business, and maybe giving them the tools and processes to manage that and facilitate the work. Oh, and charging for that work facilitation. Right? Insert Jesse, VCSO services.
Insert like this something scorecard thing. So like in the doctor's office, I guarantee you there's some kind of SAS, right? That checks like, is this person, did they fill in a form? Was it entered? Right. Like, so there's tools that tool is helping them basically enforce or double check that they did all those right things, because if they get in trouble. So
well, and to your point, right? Like, I'm going to say it, and that's what I like about compliance scorecard. Shameless plug for, this guy's tool over here.
I get the direction.
No, I got. Am I going the right way? It looks like I'm going the right way. Do I got to point at this?
Yeah.
Right, anyways.
Was I going the right way before?
Funny. But no. Point being is, so we're going to look at an asset management policy from CIS that you can go get for free later in the show. But what do you do with that? It sits on a shelf, and are you even doing those asset management things that you say that you're doing in the policy? Where is the sync between the policy and the process, right? And I think that's what I like about compliance scorecard, Tim. The first thing you probably showed me when you had your MVP was that, hey, we take the policy, the actual list of assets from the RMM tool, and then we approve it. And when a new one's added, we actually verify that it's an authorized asset, and we're actually doing what we say we're doing in the policy. And so there's that balance, or that tension between what the policy does and what the process actually is. And keeping those in sync, I think, is the difficult part, or the part that doesn't get done well in a lot of organizations, right?
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning us. There's a lot of marketing claim around continuous compliance, right? I don't want to, because that's going to get off topic here and we're going to end up going off the rails, right? But, here's the thing. If you're going to put in policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines, and you're going to do that work and facilitate that work with your customer, and by the way, we are advocating to do that work. If you're going to do that, make sure it actually aligns to the existing business practices already in place, right? We talk a lot about our 4-part process, and that very first part is the alignment phase. Don't just grab a template for the sake of grabbing a template, because I guarantee you what's in that template is what's not actually in place. And this is where a lot of these companies get stumbled. Right. We have hundreds of templates. Awesome. It is not aligned at all to the business practices in place. Now, as an MSP, actually doing the work and facilitating the work and having password managers and backups and security awareness training and having all the tools in the stack, you're in the best position to actually help them facilitate the work, because you're providing the tools and the vCISO and the services around all those policies and procedures, right? So now, as the MSP and charging for that policy work, you can be that trusted advisor, and you can easily align those documents to the actual things in place, because you're doing the work, because you have the tool, because you have the people, right? That's kind of our stake, is make sure these damn things are aligned. Stop downloading a template, because you're actually going to end up having more risk by not tailoring that policy and that procedure and that standard. Because when the crap hits the fan and they find these policies, procedures, and documents and say, your policy says you're doing this, but you didn't.
Right.
Yeah, it's not going to have intended behavior, right, Tim? So it's just useless.
I would say, so you're spot on, Tim. Obviously, you've done this once or twice, but this, but that's one of the things, again, that in terms of vCISO and delivering vCISO services, a tip for MSPs is when you're going through your onboarding, part of it should be going through existing policies, and part of it, or writing the new policies. And so you have your template policy pack, right? Or you have your compliance scorecard and you're going through this. The thing I would sit down and talk through with the clients is like, okay, here, we have this continuous monitoring policy. It says you're doing SIM, EDR, so on and so forth, all these different things. You have vulnerability management in place. It's saying you have all these things. And I would go through, are you doing this? Well, we know they're not, right? So we know they're not doing vulnerability management. Okay, so we're going to have to leave that out of this policy, or we're not doing this, or we're not checking enough boxes. I'd say we can't even put this policy in place right now. So you're creating then a roadmap with your clients and saying, okay, we need to do all these things, and now they're seeing it. We need to meet this regulatory burden, but we're not actually doing the things we are. And now all of a sudden in their mind, it's anchored with what they need to actually accomplish. And it becomes a very easy conversation with a trusted advisor, like you said, Tim, rather than let me sell you another tool, right? Which is how they would perceive it otherwise.
Exactly. And so, I mean, we're gonna get into actually opening up a sample document here from our good friends at CIS in a couple of minutes. We're gonna end up like walking through, one of the things that I have found over the 20 years of doing this. Well, first, we do have a lot more available template type things across the internet, right? 20 years ago, none of this existed. I had to write all this stuff from scratch, and I'm like, fortunately, I worked for an educational company that had really great proofreaders because, you all know me, I can't type worth of crap. And so we do live in as an MSP, there is a wealth of stuff out there, free and paid, good and bad. Your mileage will vary. But the key point in all of those templates is you better damn well tailor them to the actual business processes in place, because if you're not, you're exposing yourself and your customer to way more risk than they're probably wanting to be accustomed to. right?
Yeah.
A bad policy that isn't written appropriately will expose you to way more risk. So, anyways, that's my soapbox. Don't use a template unless you actually tailored it.
Yeah.
That's the guy with dozens of templates.
And if you're using one, or if you're putting stuff in place, for goodness sakes, don't send it to a client saying or to a regulator, forbid that, saying we do these things and you don't actually do them, right?
That's even worse.
Even worse. So, and again, this is why, again, it's important to, again, take the workflow and procedural process. So I think for all the hyperbolic statements, I think Tim and I are pretty aligned there.
Hold on, I'm logging in over here. Hopefully it doesn't mess with my internet connection. Okay. I will do a little bit of a shameless plug, right? Because we've been talking about templates for the last 10 or 15 minutes. One thing that we do extremely different than all the other templates platforms is actually provide you explanation text on how to write the damn thing. What goes in this box? Each section of the policy document as you're building it out. Yeah. I have poured us, and make sure I'm not saying I anymore. We have poured our heart and soul into teaching you how to write this thing, why to write this thing, what goes in this box. And so that is a major differentiator. I know, shameless plug, we don't ever really talk a lot about, tools here on Team Tim, but sorry, I digress. But
what are some good terms to type into ChatGPT when I'm looking for a policy?
You type in, how can compliance scorecard help me with policy? And you'll be surprised what it will be. I'm kidding.
It'll pop up.
I would say that ChatGPT can help, right? Because we're going to get totally off the rails here.
So let's do it. Let's
do it, right? So let's just take our good friends at CIS, right? We love what they're doing. Everybody follows through CIS, blah, blah, blah. Great stuff, right? We're going to get into this in a few minutes, but, to answer Tim's question on where can large language models, LLMs, generative AI, the GPTs, where can that help us in a policy? Take the redacted statement, pop it in there and say, help me rewrite this into third grade reading level so my staff can understand it.
Yeah, I agree. There you go.
I agree.
Well, by the way, Compliance Scorecard is now starting to do that.
Nice.
So,
shorten this. Shorten this. So it's interesting, Tim. This is funny. I go back and, like you said, back 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of templates. You had some stuff that was on the CIS website that linked through to some SANS policies. And so you had to fill that in with what your regulatory requirements were, right? So I go back and I read these policies that I originally wrote 10 years ago, and I'm like, oh, who is this guy? Was he thinking anyone's going to read this? And it's just these long scholastic, like a lawyer wrote them. I'm like, nobody's reading that, right? So taking those and putting them into ChatGPT and saying, can shorten this to get the essence of what this is trying to say out. Oh, make it no longer than 2 sentences, right?
Yeah, and I do love the idea of using large language models. I don't think they're mature enough, and I totally think that they're not privacy and protected and secured enough.
Yeah.
So if you're planning to do that, redact it, use acme.com. Don't use anything identifiable if you're planning to do that, especially on specific business processes, because, don't do that.
I think that's it just made me think of something, Tim. Like, it's a great thing to think about when writing policies, though, because you don't want to give away OSINT, right, to the organization. And so if you're writing a policy, if you wouldn't put it in ChatGPT, don't put it in the policy, right?
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned reviewing, because I remember reviewing some documents I wrote back in 07, 08, doing through our audit, blah, blah, blah. And there was a section in there that was like, we use snort and acid. And I remember the auditor being like, what the heck is this snort and acid stuff? I'm like, well, snort is the scanner and acid is the reporting engine.
Right.
And he's like, I can't believe you wrote, we're doing management using snort on acid. And he's like, yeah. And then there were a couple of spots where it was like we actually mentioned Spiceworks because things didn't exist back then. Spiceworks was one of the things that did. So
Right.
this is where that life cycle comes into play, right, Jesse? And being able to continuously review them. Yeah. Tim? What do I type into Chat GPT? Nothing proprietary and nothing identifiable.
That's right. It's almost like you want a ghost computer when you're in there. Like, where's this coming from? So, yeah. No, let's get into it, right? Like, I think we left some really good fundamentals on. We're trying to govern intent or behavior, right? So, let's stop ourselves a couple times while we're doing this, while we're redlining this, and see if it's like, are we still on the rails, as Tim said, in terms of behavior?
Well, I think first, I'm a pretty big proponent of standardizing documentation so that it has a well-defined structure, especially if you're grabbing multiple different templates from multiple different sources, they are completely inconsistent, right? Mm-hmm. And an auditor and an assessor and an insurance company and a DFAR, like, they're going to recognize that you got 40 different things from 40 different places with 12 different fonts and 17 different logos. So I'm a huge proponent of standardizing them, right? And moving that beyond, it has a title page and a footer, like actually standardizing the internal structure of the document. And CIS is starting to do this a little bit. And I have been working with this whole concept of OSCAL. You don't know what OSCAL is? Go Google it. Been putting together a standardized structure for policymakers to be able to follow. Every document has an executive summary that has a purpose, that has a management intent, right, Jesse? Right? It has outcomes. Mm-hmm. It has, definitions of definitions and terms, the actual policy. It has these core key components of a document. And when you get them all standardized, then you can eventually do policy as code, right? Frameworks as code, responses as code, and actually get to what Jesse mentioned earlier, which is actually proving and operationalizing that these things are actually in effect, because now you have a machine readable structure talking to a machine readable tool to prove the work. Right. So let's get into
just real quick, Tim. Yeah. I just want to define OSCAL for people that want to look it up. So it's OSCAL, the Open Security Controls Assessment Language. It's from NIST, so it's reputable. Go look it up and start applying those concepts like Tim is talking about.
Yeah.
Without further ado.
I'll go ahead and drop that link in here. Hold on. Let me go over here. Make sure I'm on. Hold on. Let's do this. So for those of you that are interested in actually working alongside us in the project, I went ahead and I'm open sourcing this. Right. I want the community involvement. Right. This is not just going to be a Tim thing. This is like, let's build the structure for everybody at large. And I'll also drop in OSCAL from NIST, so you all know where to go for that. It's pretty easy. Pages.nist. Blah, 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 blah. Thank you so much, Jesse, for reminding me to make sure I drop that in there. So there we go. All right, let's get into what we actually came here to talk about and ripping this thing apart, maybe. So I'm gonna Tim, can you drive the stream while I drive the Word document?
I'm not actually in the.
No, of course not. Yeah. Well, then let me know if something comes up that I should deal with.
You got it.
We're good.
First and foremost, yay, cover page. We all like cover page, right? Remember that, Oh, look, table of contents. We all love table of contents. Those are good to have.
What about the cover page? Do you like the date on the cover page? I don't know that I do.
So I would say that the cover page is sort of subjective, right? Yeah. I believe that because in this the way this one's structured versus the way I would
Mm-hmm.
structure it, there's a change management table that is the very
Mm-hmm.
last thing.
Right.
Well,
Right.
in our opinion, that should be at the top. So
Hmm.
in that change management table, the who, the
Right.
when, the authorizations, like right there. So cover page, in my opinion, I don't know, subjective, date, no
Okay.
date, I don't care. No, I don't care.
Okay.
I do like the fact that it lists the actual title. So blah, 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 blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah, policy, as opposed to blah, 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 procedure, blah, 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 standard, blah, blah, blah. Like,
Right.
I do like the
Right.
fact that it has the title right there.
Let's
You know,
let that's just an interesting point. You talked about standardization. I think that you need to standardize on titles, exactly like you're talking about. Do we have like our policy about policies? What is a policy? What is a playbook? What is a workflow? What is a process, right? We should have that defined. And we should have our standard naming convention for our policies so they stack up together in a document management system in that way. Anyways, I digress. Continue.
no, no, no. And I think it's great because I'm actually on the other screen over here pulling up my policy on policies.
There you go. I love it. Love it.
Although it is in the platform, so I have to make sure that yeah, I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
I was going to pull up my policy on policy, but I don't want to
How about
plug the
this?
platform.
If you want to see it, hit Tim up for a demo and he'll show you that policy on policies.
All right. Well, again, the point of Team Tim is not to plug our stuff. So, but the only
Right.
way my documents exist is in my platform because I don't deal
Right.
with Word docs and SharePoints and
Yeah.
blah blah blah. So,
Yeah.
Amanda, hold on, she's got a really great here. Isn't it funny that definitions get lost in
Oh.
policy writing? Oh, but wait. It depends on how
So-
you structure your document because we tend to love ensuring that there is a glossary, just like CIS, right? Making sure there is a glossary of terms,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Jesse, do you have something you want to add to that?
Yeah. So going back to, I'm just talking about my approach to policies is what I got in the habit of doing is having a glossary, but having a separate glossary that was linkable, and then I would have recurring terms that we would use in the policy, like sensitive data or protected data, and defining those in each document. So having a quick TLDR at the top of the policy that defines these pivotal terms that we're going to use in the policy to make sure everyone understands them, but striking a balance between not making it too long that you get lost in it, but if someone sees a capitalized term, they can flip right back up there and see what it means. So anyways, continue.
Yeah.
Great point.
No, I love that. I love that idea, right? So, let's throw
that policy you just showed me didn't look too simple. That rule you had in the beginning.
Yeah. Jesse, would we agree that policy documentation, standards, procedures, the things, should they be one really long 7,000 page document, or should they be broken up by topic in a particular subject area or a particular domain?
I'm all for broken up.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen some like 60-page incident response plans. Yeah.
So in my
Is my
work,
internet dying? Is that what's going on here?
No, it's not bad.
in my work with the federal government, writing a
Okay.
SSP, right, System Security Plan, that document was 300 or 400 pages long, and it was not easy, right?
Yeah.
And so, I'm a huge proponent of break them down into individual discrete areas or discrete domains, but tie them all together.
Yeah.
Right? Like you were saying, Jesse, maybe you have just one document that's called glossary. And anytime you use SDLC, it's clickable to the glossary.
Right.
right?
Right.
So,
Yep.
I know we're
Yep.
coming up on only 20 minutes left here. We wanted to hack this thing apart, right, Tim? We wanted to kind of dig into this a little bit and like maybe pull up a section, get past the table of contents and the acknowledgments. Thank you so much, NIST, for doing this. Great job as always. It's a little long, but let's get it. How do you? Well, I would say that. I would say the first 8 pages is basically how to do this thing, which is great because that's what we want to be able to teach MSP. But
so
here's the template.
But the human being, the employees, like their attention span is probably half a page. Yeah.
So here's my take on that, Tim. I'm right with you. Like all that stuff, how to use this document, how to do that, like that's in the table of contents, but it should be at the bottom. Like the actual actionable information, like where Tim's sitting on what is this, page 5 or 9 or whatever it is, that should be at the top, right under the table of contents. Let's launch right into it. Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to knock the people that put this policy together because again, like you said, our friends at CAS, they've done a ton and are doing a ton for the community. And a lot of this it's a template. So, take it and use it. Don't just stick it in your document management system. But yeah, this needs to go at the top for the users because that's who's reading it. People that need to know what to do.
Mm-hmm. So again, back to the structure. Title, great. First thing, purpose, responsibility, then the policy. I actually break this out a little bit further, and I put the executive summary, the management intent, kind of those things at the top so that everybody knows this is what the execs expect. This is the intended audience, this is the purpose, and this is the scope. And then you get into the policy, right? So that structure can help everybody in the organization understand from a top-down approach, what is the management's intent? Who does this apply to? And then what the heck is it, right? And so I love the fact that they at least have purpose and responsibility. I might have structured that a little bit differently, but let's actually let's just look at some of the words here, right? And so enterprise, asset management, process. I have to sneeze. Hold on one second. Darn fall allergies, right when I'm trying to read. This policy provides the process and procedures for governing the stuff. Wait a minute. This is a policy. The policy talked about the process and procedure? I don't know, Jesse. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
I think we picked a really hard policy.
Yeah.
Considering the CIS controls with Matt Lee, we talked about what is an asset for 2 hours.
Yeah.
I think we talk a very tough policy, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. Well, so I would say I would change that instead of policies and procedures. I would say the guidelines and governance for the enterprise asset life cycle. Right.
Hold on, Mr. Tim. Let's do this.
And I think this is almost like I think like this like asset management, right? Like this is like a TED talk. Like this is like CIS, rankings and prioritization, right? Like this is the number one important thing you need to do for cybersecurity. Yeah, for all the experts, for all the data, for all looking backwards, right? Like,
all right, let's pick a different one.
There we go.
I had to pick the hardest one. All right, well, I just picked another one. Vulnerability management, right?
Second hardest.
Yeah. Do you want me to open another one? Like I grabbed a bunch of them this morning for us to kind of
debate on this subject. Yeah.
Right. Let's go down to the actual document. Blah blah blah. Further, just holy crap.
Do you guys? So that's the other thing is policies are not here to educate, in my opinion. Right? They're to like if we need to educate, there's separate stuff for that. Like I don't know. That's some. I don't want to go on down a rabbit hole too much, but go ahead, Tim.
This is the piece that gets me, right? Intermingling the word policy with procedures and process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's part, and maybe there's something here that if I dig deeper, I might. But intermingling the word policy with process and procedure is a big no-go for me. right?
Yeah.
This is either a policy document or it's a procedure SOP document. It can't,
Yeah.
in my opinion, can't and probably shouldn't be both.
You it can, but it's going to be so long, it's going to be unusable. And like you said, so let's move on to responsibility because I like some things that I see there. The IT business unit is responsible for all vulnerability management functions. Specifically, administrators are responsible for
Yeah.
assessment and application. That's I really like that, right, Tim?
Yes, because it explicitly calls out the who.
Right, right. IT is responsible for informing all users of their responsibilities. So that goes back to we have a specific vulnerability management process, workflow, flow chart for specific types of systems. If there's a DevOps team that is governing the SDLC process, and there needs to be a vulnerability management process built by IT and a consensus driven from those groups that says this is the way we do things. And that doesn't go in the policy, right? But I like this piece of it that we're getting specific about who's responsible to do what.
Exactly. I do love that as well. And so, again, back to the structure, right? Having a box that talks about the responsibility and getting into a few high levels of it's, IT people, right? It's admin people. It's people that have the access and then communicating that up and down the chain appropriately. So I love that.
Right.
You know what I like too? Is the next one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because, I talk about this a lot in our wire fraud policy because not everybody in the company actually has the capability of touching money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I need to make sure when I'm writing a wire fraud policy that I have those exceptions that say, the person on the shop floor that just sweeps and has no ability to touch money, I need to make an exception for that. This is right. I need to account for that. Right.
Pull up Andrea's comment here because I think that applies to something I was going to say about this section.
Yeah, I was
this
getting
is great. Yeah, this is great. It doesn't get into the tasks and activities. That is first procedure. So let's flip back to the policy and look at something real quick here that I don't necessarily agree with, although I understand why it's in a template. So exceptions must contain the reason for the request. I would say exception requests must be submitted using the current exception request form located here. Link to the exception request form that contains all of those things. Now, there may be a reason that you need to have that to meet a regulatory purpose, is that your policy must specify XYZ. And so that's where I get back to maybe you need to have it. But I like the idea, like she said, not having to go back and change this if there's another field that we now need to start asking for in our request. Like, why wouldn't we just have that in the Microsoft form that we're submitting for this and just refer to the form in the policy? That's how you start making modular and actually you get economies of scale when you're doing that,
Right. So, and if I were writing this, I would probably, Tim, where the hell is my little font thing? I would do this. And I would redline that sucker out because this is the whole purpose of today's call is redlining a policy together, right? And I would leave it with they just must made in writing. And we could do something like SUB submit here.
Right.
Link.com. And then I would be like, I would take all this stuff out because it's not applicable, right?
Yep.
And this is where that section ends.
Now, here's the thing. This is a template. So they're CIS in the way that they're trying to give you a good indication of what should be done, right? So this is where the customization of your policy is important, and it's not just taking a template because there's nothing wrong with this template, but this is what you're doing when you're customizing this for your company or the client, right?
Exactly. And if I could, I don't know, I'll just click on, what are we talking here? Vulnerability management. Do I have that?
Yeah, so what's the intended result here, right? You want to prove that you have removed dangerous vulnerabilities from the system at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, Tim, I guess where does that kind of like the doing thing and the responsibility and the like, how does that tie back right into compliance scorecard? Like, how do you how do you talk into like, how do you tie in the the metrics in the performance of the policy?
How do I do it? Well,
Yeah.
as you know, as part of our 4-part framework, we actually assign the human responsible.
Yeah.
We can actually put the name, email address, and dates and things in the platform to be able to actually assign that work to that human and get them to accept, sign off, and do the things. Right.
So that's
Yeah, I
more on the
think
compliance side. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
and I think at the bottom, like you're going to see this in most policies, is compliance and sanctions, right? The company will verify this policies through various methods, audits, including monitoring, so on and so forth. So that's like you said, Tim, the thrust of how we're going to monitor this with KPIs, but the specifics of it are going to be done through methods that are in procedures and playbooks and things like that, right? So how do we monitor our vulnerability management specifically? That's in the vulnerability management workflow where it says we fix a vulnerability, we retest, we verify that it's fixed, and then we mark it as closed and the ticket gets closed, right? That's the workflow process of then how we're verifying that it's done.
Yep, that's the procedural element, right?
Right.
Monitor, they talk, and then revision history at the end of the document. Like I have to scroll all the way to page 11 to find out when this was last updated, who approved. Oh, wait, did they even have that? Nope, they just have the version, the date, and a name. So we take this quite a few steps further, and I firmly believe that checks and balances. So you should have a reviewer and an approver. Now, and yeah, we get it. Small companies might only be one human, but anytime you can have two people as part of the process, great case in point. I'm putting together another webinar series. I sent over the images for people to look at. They sent them back. I had a fat finger. I sent them fix that. They sent them back. I had a fat finger. Like that whole revision, that whole change management piece of it wasn't just me saying we're good here. Having that checks and balances. So I take the revision history a few steps further to include at least two people, and I don't put it at the bottom of the document.
Right.
Here, right now, whether you in the structure you have that header footer, whether those change dates are header footer, I don't know. But for me, the revision history is like first in line after the title page.
Yeah, and I'm of the opinion too that if you're in a system like a digital system that can track revision histories, and you could see that in like a pop up or in a separate history, button, I don't even need it on the policy. Like I don't really care at that point. Like if I can find the revision history, I don't really care. But as a user, I just need to see what I need to do, and I don't really care about when the last revision happened. That's more for auditors, and so that can be a separate piece, right? Yeah.
Oh, you mean something like this in the knowledge base where you can see it and you can expand it and contract it if you chose to.
Right. Exactly.
Sorry. I keep plugging my thing.
Exactly. But no, you're right. That's the thing. Those are the benefits of a digital platform. Bottom line. But again, you're never going to get there if you're just sticking documents into a digital platform and forgetting about them. You're not getting any benefit at that point, right? So
yeah, Tim, talk about the scolding you get if you don't come back and try to just like push your policies into a cabinet and make them go away. So
yeah,
you go feel free to plug and talk about your refreshing and like the fact that it's a life cycle, right? The fact that you can't just leave it there and forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jesse and we talked about that in the beginning. These are living, breathing documents. They don't just sit there, right? They need to be at least annually reviewed. Gosh darn it! Our disaster recovery when we were doing backups and restores, we dealt with ours every quarter, right? Yeah. We dealt with ours in some instances almost monthly, because you don't want to be that 14-year-old employee handbook collecting dust. And now you have all these employees working remotely, asking to have internet paid for and TV paid for and all the things paid for because you don't have an employee handbook or some kind of agreement that says this is what we offer or don't offer. Yeah. Because you haven't touched it in 14 years, right?
Yeah. last thing I was thinking about, Tim, too, is on that, we were talking about that. Well, first thing is the asset management policy. One thing I didn't mention is I did like how short the actual policy was. I thought it was like a page, right? Um, but on the vulnerability management piece, we talked about, hey, that it's got to have these five things, and we would remove that. But here's the problem, and probably why it contains that, right? Is that on a vendor DDQ due diligence request from a potential customer, they're like, we need to make, do you do these five things when you have an exception? And you say, oh yeah, we do. It's in a proprietary form that you can't see. And they're like, well, we want to see your security policies. So we got to put those five bullets in there to meet the requirement, right? So a way around that, or a happy medium, is to say, use the most recent form contained here, which contains at a minimum these five things, and then you can update the other things as you see fit, right? So just
or,
wanted
or,
to.
or or you just have a tool that you can share the knowledge base with all the documents to your customer, to your auditor,
Or
to be
that.
able to be like, here they all are. All right.
All right.
All right.
Oh
Yes.
yeah. Oh, where did that time go?
It is now 4 minutes of.
That's it. Wrap it up, fellas.
I do believe I could talk this conversation all day. For those that didn't get the chance to attend this because you're all over on the Empath event, please do come back. Please fire some comments in chat, right? We did have some really great ones in there. We did talk a little bit about, Copilot and LLMs in the beginning of the conversation, so maybe hit rewind a little bit. We did talk about the use of them and the potential challenges of, information that you probably shouldn't be putting in there. So just be careful on that. Andrea, thank you so much for being here. Tim, what do we have coming up next? Oh, wait, we're not even do that. We're supposed to do the key takeaway. Hold on. I'm like not even doing my own thing. Jesse, key takeaway.
Key takeaway is to customize your documentation. Make sure that, number one, templates are great. Use a template for a starting point, but customize it to what you're actually doing, what your processes actually are accomplishing, and then shorten it and make it a guideline or governance for the actual processes, which I would say separate out into separate workflows.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Mr. Tim, let me pull you up over here and give you some, stage time.
Less is more, right? So not all controls need policies. Some are done with tools, and think about intended behavior. And if the policy is not producing the intended behavior, it's clearly broken. So it goes along with that customized aspect of what are the business objectives of your specific business that you're trying to achieve.
Awesome. And I suppose I get to continue to plug myself. Wait a minute. Hold on. How does that work? I don't know. It's our show. I'll just plug myself anyway. So
you got to keep it to it. Yeah, man. There you go.
My key takeaway around policies and procedures is number one, have a dedicated human to help guide the process. Number two, make sure that the actual documents align to actual business processes in place. And number three, make sure you have a process for managing the whole thing: alignment, authorization, adoption, and assessment. Walk through that with your customers as an MSP. And by the way, don't forget to charge for that work, because this is billable time, my friends, as Jesse would tell you.
Awesome. Next week, ScalePad, I believe.
Next week is Lewis talking about compliance as a service.
He's from ScalePad, is he not?
Ooh, all right.
Yeah. He said no.
Yeah,
I didn't. Let's wrap it up.
All right, everybody. We didn't have all the people that we wanted to hear, because everybody's over
you got
on
the best stuff at the end about alignment, assessment. I think that's the good stuff, right? We should come back to that. So
alignment, authorization, adoption, and assessment.
Absolutely.
All right. Make sure I grab the right exit screen, and we're out, everybody. Have a good week. We'll see you next week when we're talking compliance as a service.
Later, everyone.
Subscribe now.